Good evening. I think we're going to get started if you want to take your seats. Good evening. I'm Eve Vogelstein, the president of Great Talk, and thank you for joining us for this live and virtual conversation for sharing ideas with the very best minds. I'd like to thank the Great Talk Gold sponsors, the Zaf McKinney Group at Morgan Stanley, and LifeBridge Health for their financial support, and a big thank you to our longtime VIP partner, the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And thank you also to our media co-sponsors, the Baltimore Sun and the Baltimore Fishbowl. We are also very appreciative of the donations made by our generous supporters. Last but not least, we are deeply grateful to Rector David Ware and Ellen Chittard, Director of Events, for graciously offering the Church of the Redeemer to be the wonderful venue for this evening community event. This is amazing. It's just such a beautiful space. Thank you so much. Great Talk was founded by our executive director, Claudine Davison, and our vice president, Diane Davison. And then Great Talk took off with me as president, an outstanding board, numbers of Maryland institutions as our venues, and lots of Great Talk friends. The goodwill of so many enables all of us to enjoy these thought-provoking and educational programs. We are all a volunteer, nonprofit organization which depends on your tax-deductible donations to continue programs, to make these programs available for free, like tonight's program. Please sign up for our mailing list at Great Talk. Our website is greattalk.org. And there you'll be notified when the recording of this event will be posted on YouTube, along with updates on our future Great Talk events. So tonight's topic, once again, is quite a timely subject. It is now my pleasure to introduce the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, William Eggington, who will introduce tonight's panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve, and thanks to all of you who've come in person for this first Great Talk of this, from my perspective, academic year, from this year. It's exciting in particular to be back, at least partly back, in person. It's a wonderful space, and I add my thanks to Eves, to David, and to the organizers here at Church of the Redeemer. And to all of you who are joining us on Zoom, again, it is a pleasure to have you with us as well, virtually as well as in person. So now we've entered into a new age of hybrid models of presenting these fantastic conversations. So I'm going to go directly into the event of the evening, and I'm going to begin by introducing the four experts that we brought together to discuss this evening the question of geopolitical domination by China, Russia, or the United States, global disruption, and broken alliances. To begin with, I'm going to start all the way on my left. Jeff MANKOFF is a distinguished research fellow at the U.S. National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. Next to Jeff, HORACE BARTILOW is a professor of international political economy and American foreign policy at the School of International Service at American University. Next to Horace, Matthew KAMINSKI is Politico's editor-in-chief, overseeing all editorial operations of the publication. And finally, immediately to my left, GISELLE DONNELLY is a senior fellow in defense and national security at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on national security and military strategy, operations, programs, and defense budgets. The way we'll go this evening is I'm essentially going to start the ball rolling with a few questions, get out of the way, let our experts get into a robust discussion. They can converse with each other. Back to me, I'm getting a sign that I need to speak more loudly. I hope everyone can hear me. Is that better? They will speak amongst themselves. I'll ask some more questions, and at a certain point, I'm going to bring down a microphone, put it at that stand, and please feel free to stand up and form a line to ask questions yourself. We'll be running about an hour, all right? Thank you, everybody, and now let's get into it with our first question. Panelists, let's start talking about this. In your estimation, what factors, what tools are most important for a nation to establish some kind of geopolitical power, even domination, in the 21st century? Does anyone want to take a first stab at that? Giselle or Horace?
Sure.
Giselle, all right.
I'm happy to do it, sure.
Thank you.
The 21st century is not entirely different from previous centuries. So I would say that military power still remains the ultimate resort of states and monarchs and kings and leaders of one sort.
Oh, they would like
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, there we go.
test that.
One hesitates to eat the microphone. How about that? Okay? Okay, Rev. Thanks very much.
I see.
I'm not sure I can read that. However, I will quickly repeat what I said. So I would say that the 21st century is not unlike previous human experience in that military power and, of course, wealth and also principle are the elements that make some powers greater than other powers. There is, at the moment, obviously, a moment of international competition, great power competition, as the administration would say, which is something that we have not experienced really since the end of the Cold War. Alas, the invasion of Ukraine reminds us that military power is still the coin of the realm, so to speak. And even though technologies are changing and human societies are evolving as well, I think to turn our backs on the sort of geopolitical and power wisdom of the ages in a moment like this would be a mistake.
So would you say that, and this is also for the rest of the panelists, that this great power competition or this reshuffling is one of the major distinguishing factors of 21st versus at least the latter half of the 20th century? Anyone else want to?
I'll keep talking until somebody gives me the... Yeah, just to complete my introductory thoughts. Yes, I would just throw out as a straw man that the Ukraine war will lead to a diminishment of Russian power. But the rising power of the Chinese is probably the focus of international politics for the first half of the coming century.
For sure. Yes, Jeff.
Should I use one of the...
Oh, no.
Those
Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to speak up. So let me touch on the first question that you asked, and then I'll come over to the second. I agree that military power remains in some ways the ultima ratio among states in the 21st century, as it has always been. I would say, though, that the generation of military power and the meaning of military power has changed, in part because of technological evolution. So it's not enough to simply have more guns and more bombs if those bombs and guns can't be integrated with technological systems that allow for targeting, that allow for the integration of lots of big data and other kinds of information to make more effective use of those weapons. And this is partially what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. Russia has a very large military. It has a very large arsenal of relatively old, relatively dumb bombs. And what the Russians are discovering in Ukraine is that even though they outnumber Ukrainian forces pretty significantly, Ukrainian forces have an advantage in morale, but beyond that, the Russian technical capabilities are not keeping up with the state of the art that's being produced in the West, which has been giving significant amounts of military assistance to Ukraine. So it's not simply military power in terms of counting the numbers of bombs or warheads, tanks, ships, planes, or soldiers. It's the capabilities of those weapons, which in some ways is downstream to the level of technological sophistication and the ability to integrate, especially information technology, into weapon systems. On this issue of great power competition, and others, feel free to jump in. I think that there was a moment at the end of the Cold War where we thought great power competition had basically ended. We were in what Charles Krauthammer, who wrote in Time magazine, called the unipolar moment. That was a moment. I think that moment has largely passed. Those people who were paying close attention, even during this unipolar moment, including Krauthammer, knew that it was a moment, that it wasn't going to be permanent. It was the consequence of the rapid collapse of the Soviet Union and all of its political and military capabilities. And what's happened since then is not that necessarily the United States has diminished, although the United States obviously has its problems. It's that other countries have closed the gap by growing faster, by developing new capabilities. And so even though the US is in absolute terms more powerful than it was in, say, 1989 or 1991, the relative balance of power between the United States on the one hand and China on the other, or Russia's a more complicated case right now, has narrowed. And it's not only those countries as well. I think one of the under-discussed elements of the way that the political landscape is changing in the modern world is that in part because of the importance of technology, other powers are rising, are playing a larger role regionally, are developing capabilities that will allow them to constrain the actions of the three countries that we think about as great powers, or to act in other ways that may have significant impact on the operation of the global system. Speak louder, okay. I'm going to try. So, right now we don't think of countries like India, or Indonesia, or Brazil, or Mexico as being great powers, and by traditional measures they're not. But certainly the diffusion of power within the international system, the development of economic and technological capabilities means that in certain areas, both geographic and functional, these other players are now more capable of acting independently than they were, let's say, during the Cold War. And I think that has implications for the way that we think about the global system and for the use of this term, great power competition.
I think, the Ukraine war is showing us that the 20th century is still here. And yet, I do think there are a couple of sort of, at least not just wrinkles, but I think fundamental changes in how we conceive of power and think about power in this century. And I guess I would just to make it very brutally simple, one is the power of attraction, the power of your model. I think it's much more important than it ever was, whether what makes countries strong is our ability to win over allies, to bring in immigrants, talented people to work in our countries because technology is so important, because creativity, economic creativity is so essential to not just having the smartest, best weapons, but having the strongest economies. And I think, secondly, that I really do think that that's sort of that. I always find that I think even having Russia as part of a conversation of great powers seems almost absurd, notwithstanding their nuclear arsenal, because they really have no friends. They have no economic model that anyone wants to copy. No one really wants to go there. And I would say similarly for China, I would actually argue that China is overhyped as a rising power and a rising threat, precisely because it too is not attracting allies, it's not attracting immigrants, and internally it doesn't have the mechanisms to self-correct, to really kind of really adjust to a fast-changing 21st century. And so I guess I would make the unfashionable claim that actually, despite all our problems in this country, I would still think that America is the rising power of the 21st century and will end this century as the great power without really great competition, maybe even more so than it ended the 20th century.
Well, unfashionable opinions are often great in a situation like this because they can spark debate. I don't know, Horace, if you have something to say to that or to anything else that any of us are saying.
Is my mic working?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Loudly.
I
That's good.
I agree with certain of the propositions, but what I do disagree about is certain underlying assumptions. The first one being that there is some sort of a great power rivalry. I suppose if you define rivalry as China wants to grow and have its place in the world, then that's a very, very general term. But let's look at certain facts, right? Let's look at certain empirical facts. The United States has 750 military bases around the world, spread out across 80 nations. So the U.S. has more military bases than there are countries in the world. There are only 195 countries in the world. After the United States, Britain has something like 145, remnants of the old colonial British Empire. Russia has 36. China only has 5.
5.
Yeah.
5.
Yeah, just 5. And yet we're talking about China as threatening U.S. power. The United States, if it ends this century, will go down as the largest empire that humankind has ever seen. You can't talk about other states competing with you when you have more military bases around the world than there are countries. Secondly, I also want to say this about China. China is definitely a rising economic power, and to a large extent, they are also putting their economic resources to build their military. I would disagree with my colleagues by saying that no one is attracted to China. If you look at the Afro barometer or the Latin barometer, Africans, Latin Americans view China more as a friend than they do the United States. In fact, I was just running some analysis about this as we speak yesterday. So it's really not true that China, no one is attracted to China. In fact, China's influence, especially in the developing world, is growing much faster than the United States, which is something that American policymakers should be worried about. But so the real question that we should be asking is, why is there so much to do about China? Right, that is the underlying question here. You can't see China as a military threat when they only have 5 military bases in the world, right? I mean, that's just ridiculous. So the question then is, what is it about China that the United States fear? And we have to look at the long history of what I call xenophobia, right? We have to look at the racial dimensions of world power to get at some of these answers. But as we speak, the United States is still a major empire in the world. It runs an empire in the world that was established after World War II. It established the Bretton Woods system, which is still functioning. China is growing within an American system. So I want you to think about this. If it is possible, and it certainly is, I don't know if I will live to see it or we will live to see it in our lifetime, that China overtakes the United States, both not only economically but militarily, it would do so within the belly of an American-built system. Okay? China, basically, what we're witnessing, especially in the global economy, China is, in terms of per capita purchasing power past the United States a couple years ago, but in absolute terms, the U.S. economy is still larger. China is still growing at a much faster rate. But just assuming that this continues, and it may not, but just assuming that this continues, what the global markets will be saying is not China is intended to completely upend the liberal order, but the liberal order in the next 20 or 30 years will, for the first time, not have an Anglo-American face, but it will have an Asian face. And I believe that is what is the main fear of American policymakers. It's not that China is going to upend global capitalism, because China is one of the most successful capitalist systems going on. China raises all these questions where we are always told that you can't have a communist party. China is both communist and capitalist at the same time, right? So we have to understand the context in which these things are being said.
Horace, thank you very much. Those are some really interesting perspectives. Do I have anyone who wants to jump in on that?
Look, you know, in many ways, I agree almost 100% with Horace's analysis. However, there's one, I think, critical point. The problem with China is not that it would present, or change the international order and put an Asian face on it, is that it would put an illiberal face on it. China is a different polity, a different society, and even if one acknowledges the wrongs that have been done to China in the past, one has to acknowledge that that's a strong motivator for the Beijing regime. So I think that is, and this goes to Matt's point about which of these models, because the Chinese are certainly offering a different kind of model to the world, particularly not just sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, but, but really as they offer it as a universal model for development and for organizing a society. So for those of us who are imbued with Western Anglo-liberalism, a kind of society that now has spread also to Asia and created robust democracies there. The question about China is not will it be rich, not will it be strong, but will it be illiberal?
May I respond real quick?
Sure, and then after you.
My colleague raised a very important point, and I want to respond to this in a number of ways. It is not entirely clear that China will present an illiberal face to our liberal order. Let's be clear. Let's go back to facts and not assumptions. The Freedom House, conservative think tank that collects and measures the Freedom House Index, has shown in its recent reportings that democracies around the world are on decline. Now, many in the Biden and even the Trump administration blame this on, as my colleague just said, an illiberal face, the rise of China, which is not true. Because the United States, according to Freedom House, has dropped 11 points in the last 15 years. In other words, the United States today is less free than it was 15 years ago. And I don't think anyone in the Biden administration or previous administration would say that the decline in American freedom is because China is putting an illiberal face on America. That's ridiculous. So we know that the answer to why democracy is on the decline is a much more complex and complicated question. But we ought not to stop there. We ought to ask the question, why is it as my learned scholar has suggested, that we believe that a rising China will put an illiberal face on the liberal order. Why is it do we believe that? And I want to venture this proposition. We believe this because it is rooted in an American ontological understanding about who we are as a people in the world and who others are. There's a very important book by the man by the name of Tubison. And he defined America and American thinking, the thinking of American policymakers, that America has always seen itself as the redeemer nation. It is a nation that sees itself as redeeming. After World War II, we're saving the world for democracy. We have, and it's so very important, I'm in the Church of the Redeemer. We have a redeemer nation complex. And so, if a country like China, who is rising in the world economically and also influentially, especially in the developing world, and at the same time, it is correlated with a decline in democracy all around the world, including the United States. And if anyone didn't believe that, I think January 6th reminded us of that. And China had nothing to do with that. Okay? So we are making these connections, and they're ontological. It is our understanding of our existence and who we are as a people, as saviors of the world. And democracy, in our mind, is the proof of redemption. When countries become democratic, it is proof that they have been redeemed by the Redeemer. And so, if a China is on the rise, the assumption is the unwashed, the illiberal, will undo what has been done by the Redeemer. And in fact, there is really no empirical evidence of this. In fact, there's more evidence to the opposite, that if you have an understanding and appreciation for Chinese history, you'll recognize that China has never really wanted to make the world over into his own image. That's been the redemption nature, the redeemer mentality of Western powers, Western colonialism. I've always wanted to make people over into their own image. And the history of China does not suggest that. I think China wants economic domination, but they don't want to remake the world over into their own image.
Jeff.
Okay. So I guess let me just start there and say that on China, I disagree with that. I recently wrote a book on imperial legacies and how they shape the foreign policy outlooks of contemporary post-imperial states. China is one of those. There is a long tradition in Chinese history of China as, the term gets translated into English usually as Middle Kingdom, the center of a system whose own identity, whose own norms of behavior reach out beyond. Now, whether and to what extent that model continues to inform contemporary Chinese foreign policy, of course, is debatable, as much as it's debatable.
Precisely.
The same way it's debatable the extent to which the savior complex in the United States continues to inform American foreign policy. I think at different times in history that's been quite pronounced. I think we all remember the Bush administration and the Freedom Agenda and the idea of transformation in the Middle East through military power. I think, more recent US administrations have been much more restrained in that regard. Now, taking that as a starting point, I would say that when it comes to the US relationship with China, there are two pieces that we've been talking about up here. One is the military side. And I think that China doesn't have the same global military footprint or military ambitions that the United States has. There's no other country that has the same global military footprint or ambitions as the United States has. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we can discuss. China is becoming a more potent military power, and the implications of that are primarily being felt in China's own Asia-Pacific region. I'm sorry, we now use the term Indo-Pacific. I don't like that term, but that's the term that we use. I still say Asia-Pacific. And so countries like Taiwan are very much concerned about what the increase in Chinese military capabilities mean for them. Now, the United States cares about Taiwan because we have a mutual agreement on security. We sell them weapons. We've given various commitments to protect them that are kept somewhat ambiguous to avoid being provocative. But in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, I think are becoming at least somewhat more explicit. China is a democracy. Taiwan is a democracy. It is a flawed democracy, but it has become significantly more democratic in the last couple of decades. I think there is a real military threat that Taiwan faces from China, to the extent that the United States supports democracy as a value abroad, and the United States has never been consistent about that. In the post-Cold War era, we have gotten better about it. There are still a lot of outliers. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, which is a flawed democracy, plenty of others that the U.S. is allied with. But on balance, the U.S. preference has been for more democracy rather than less, and certainly defending existing democracies like Taiwan from potential challenges by authoritarian rivals, like in this case China. The second piece of all of this has to do with the nature of global order, global systems, global institutions. And since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has overseen or underwritten the emergence of what is sometimes referred to as a liberal international order. Now, like Voltaire said of the Holy Roman Empire, it's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. You can say sometimes that the liberal international order is neither liberal nor international nor an order, but it is, I would argue, significantly better than what we had previously, which was a world that was divided into two competing orders, one of which was dominated by state socialist parties and movements, the other that was basically defined by its opposition to state socialism and encompassed a whole range of political models, some quite authoritarian. Since the end of the Cold War, the US in particular has had a normative preference for democracy. And US institutions, US-led institutions like NATO, have placed greater emphasis on democracy as a value. Now, that doesn't mean that this is applied universally. Again, the US is allied to Saudi Arabia, right? We can just put that out there. The general preference has been for a system globally and in regional institutions like NATO that is more rather than less democratic. China and Russia are openly authoritarian. The United States is a flawed democracy. It may be an increasingly flawed democracy, but it is a democracy. China and Russia are openly authoritarian, and their preference when it comes to international systems, both globally and regionally, is at best agnostic when it comes to the internal operation of countries that participate in these systems. So Russia has made a big play internationally about the idea of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. Now, that's sort of leaving aside countries in Russia's immediate neighborhood where it's intervened very directly. But as a principle, since the onset of the Arab Spring, Russia's position has been these countries in the Middle East have their governments, they are legitimate by the fact that they exist, and the United States campaign to spread democracy in the Middle East is harmful, is disruptive, and is counterproductive. And so Russia has instead openly supported authoritarian governments and the resurgence of authoritarianism in the Middle East. It also, along with China, has supported the creation of international institutions that, again, are at the very least agnostic about the internal organization of the states that participate in them, and I would argue that have a kind of at least soft bias in favor of authoritarianism. So to take one example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is meeting this week, President Putin of Russia, President Xi of China are in Uzbekistan. They're meeting. It's President Xi's first trip abroad since the pandemic started. The SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, was set up in the early 2000s. Russia and China are the leading participants in it. It does a whole lot of things. Among them is it is committed to fighting against the so-called three evils, separatism, terrorism, and extremism. And so under this doctrine of fighting the three evils, states that are members of the SCO are committed to arresting and extraditing individuals who are charged in who they believe have participated in extremism, separatism, or terrorism. So this mostly applies to members of the Uyghur ethnic group who live in Western China, many of whom in earlier years sought refuge in Central Asia. Many of the Central Asian countries are also part of the SCO, and which China, by accusing them of participating in extremism, terrorism, or separatism, uses the SCO and uses intelligence and security service cooperation within the SCO to demand the extradition of these people, many of whom are intellectuals, artists, scholars, business people, ordinary people too, back to China because they advocated for something that in the West we would consider to be protected speech. Extremism, we can carve out a little bit. Separatism, right? If you say, you know, Texas should secede from the United States, right? That's protected speech. We're not going to send the CIA after you if you go seek refuge in Canada, right? So I think there is a fundamental difference in the way that the United States on the one hand and then Russia and China on the other approach the creation of these international institutions that comprise the global order. And that ultimately is what a lot of this competition is about. It's about which of these models of international cooperation, of international institution building is going to predominate in the years to come.
Jeff, thank you. Matt, I know that you had a hand up before. Horace, a relatively quick response. We'll go into a different. Yeah?
Jump in quickly. I'll chime in. I guess I want to say that I find it hard to reconcile the vision of the U.S. as a missionary power that's setting out to rule the world, with at least my understanding of American history going back to Washington's inaugural, the invocation to stay out of entangling alliances, to not butt into the world affairs. And in fact, for most of our history, we have shied away and not wanted to move in, between the interwar period and under Donald Trump, which had a very kind of clear isolationist tinge to his foreign policy. Wanted to pull out of NATO. So I do think that the U.S. has come in and intervened when it really had to. And I would also say I don't think it's an effort to cast the world in our image as much as a more, I think, pragmatic American sense. Let's make the world safe for trade, for capitalism, for making money, protecting our property. On the other hand, I think maybe just summarize what you were saying is that both the Russian and the Putin, let's say Putin and now President Xi in China, who is the most authoritarian and potentially the most dangerous Chinese leader since Mao, has now extended his term to be an eternal leader. Their foreign policies, their aggressive foreign policies, are really an extension of their aggressive domestic repression, and it is a means to create a narrative and legitimacy around sort of a very kind of virulent sort of nationalism in both these countries. And so I just find it almost incongruous to even compare the two.
Thank you. Yes, Horace, let's have one response on the China question, then we can move on.
I'm an empiricist, so let's look at facts and not anecdotal evidence. To be sure, China is an authoritarian regime. So is Russia. No one is making an argument about that. I would disagree with my learned colleague that China intends to remake the world over into its own image. I'm actually just completing some analysis for a forthcoming book. It is called Sinophobia and the World Order. Using recent data on China's foreign aid and running analysis on aid and regime types around the world. This is what I've found, and the current findings support the findings of my 2019 book. And what that shows is that while American policymakers, as my learned colleagues talk about, we support democracy. In parts of the world, like Latin America, for example, when the United States fights the drug war in countries like Colombia and other Latin American countries, what effect do you think that has on those countries' democracy? Well, the analysis shows that if you are a liberal democracy and you cooperate with the United States and you take US money to fight the drug war, you're 40% more likely to become an illiberal democracy. Okay? 40% more likely to become an illiberal democracy. Okay? So while American policymakers will say, oh, we support democracy, they pursue other policies that undermine what they claim they support. And in the eyes of the world, that looks like American hypocrisy. So we have to get out of our own ideology, our own biases, and have a real objective look of what we're actually doing in the world. One other point I want to make regarding China and what China, its effect on democracy. What the new data shows, if you run the analysis of Chinese aid and US aid at the same time, China's aid has zero statistical significant effect in either increasing or reducing countries' democracy. Which suggests, as my colleague says, yes, they're agnostic, but not the United States. US aid towards certain countries will worsen their democracy. That's what the data is telling us. So while we could talk about, there's all kinds of anecdotal evidence, right? Matters of this importance should be dealt with in a more empirical, scientific way, because the world depends on it.
Giselle, can I go back to you and start with a new round of just, I'd like to hear everyone on this topic, and that is what you each consider to be the single, if you can name it, greatest threat, geopolitical threat, going forward, or you can look ahead in time, something perhaps that we're not talking about yet.
To the United States?
To the United States, or if you want to say to something broader than the United States, but at the very least to the United States. Giselle, do you want to start? Did everyone hear the question? I asked what each of the panelists believe is the greatest threat, the greatest geopolitical threat, either to the United States or even to the world, and to see whether they have similar or differing opinions on that.
Well, the thing that I worry about the most is the weariness of America to play its role as an order-defining global power. That is one thing that has increased over the last several administrations of both parties, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, and I would say the jury's out on Biden's performance. He's done some great things and he's done some not so great things. But broadly speaking, and again, this is not an ideological, neither party has owns this issue, but both seem to evince, and we as a people seem to be wearying of our role and doubting ourselves, doubting our principles as being applicable to all human beings. So again, one of the things that I think, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, if we, it won't be a foreign power who defeats us. It'll be our internal divisions that divide us. And in today's world, that has global consequences.
I see. Matt.
I would say it's technology. Technology, as especially not so much the Facebook that I guess we use since we're that generation, but more the emerging technologies around sort of blockchain and around how that one in turn is going to undermine the institutions of the nation state, central banking, currency, without us thinking through what institutions will be created to replace it. And similarly, how technology is used by authoritarian states to actually make themselves stronger and sort of become potentially much stronger than us if, in the context of the power conversation here going forward.
All right, so we have on the one hand, American withdrawal, sort of self-withdrawal, and the other changes in technology that are creating all sorts of new threats. Horace.
I don't think America, the United States, can withdraw from the global economy. There are too many American transnational corporations that are very powerful in the world, and they're not going to walk away from the market. I don't think that the threat is technological. My learned friend here from Politico, they reported a couple of days ago that the Pentagon had to suspend making of the F-35s because they've discovered that some of the parts were made in China. So it's not technology. The global economy is so deeply interconnected. The real threat for all states, the United States, China, everyone, is climate change. Climate change will exacerbate, make worse the underlying tensions that already pre-exist. And there's another threat that is very pertinent to the United States that China doesn't share for obvious reasons. It's an authoritarian regime. There is a strong possibility that the United States can implode. We have in the United States, Gallup polls show that every major democratic institution, Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, banks, now even higher education, has some of the lowest legitimacy ratings amongst the American people. It is predicted that in 10 years, higher education will face a tremendous crisis. Most Americans don't think that it's worth it anymore because of high cost. But the only institution in the United States that enjoys widespread support amongst the American people, whether race, age, region, religion, is the military. So you see where I'm going with this. Those of us who study political scientists who study military coups d'etats or even civil war have been telling us that the seeds of a military America, a military authoritarian America, is already been planted in the United States. That at some point, if the United States doesn't get a handle on the growing polarization of its politics, if it doesn't get a handle on trying to create compromise, which makes democracy work, the very people whom democracy was created for will be calling for a military takeover for their own private safety. These are the threats, in my mind, loom high for the United States, in addition to climate change, more so than any other country around the world.
Jeff, how about you?
So this time I mostly agree with my colleague. I think that the biggest threat that the United States, and the United States as the linchpin for the global system, faces are internal. They have to do with, as Horace said, the legitimacy of institutions, which is very low, and I think is particularly low among younger people. Perceptions of the legitimacy of a lot of institutions is particularly low among younger people. who by a lot of demographic markers are different from older generations in terms of race, in terms of national origin, in terms of gender identity, in terms of a lot of different things. And I think that the questions about whether institutions that comprise the United States can adapt in such a way as to reflect this more diverse, more cosmopolitan American society that exists today are extremely challenging. And that problem, this questioning of the legitimacy of fundamental institutions, I think is a threat to domestic political stability, never mind to the role of the United States as a global actor.
Thank you all for that. I'm going to invite the audience now to step up, and I'll bring one of our microphones down. Do I have any questions from the audience? Yes. I'm going to bring it down right now. There you go. Actually, that's perfect.
Well, it wasn't what I was going to envision as a question, but you brought up the internal divisions of the United States. And I think a lot of it has to do with competing factions fueled by a 24-hour news cycle and politicians who should be term limited, and gerrymandering should be avoided as well, because everything now turns onto a religious jihad. Most political issues are questions of where to spend dollars and what to do with things. Obviously, there are some things that that people are very, very passionate about, but I think the political regime and the news media has turned everything into a political jihad. So if you want to build a sewage treatment plant somewhere, people are screaming and yelling, and it's it's like a civil war, when it's really just a policy issue on most things. Of course, there are some things which people feel very strongly about and have felt very strongly about in the past. So that would be an issue.
Thank you very much. Anyone want to respond to that? Matt or Jeff? Matt?
Maybe I could just start, and maybe partly response to that and partly in response to the previous two speakers. I'm struck by January 6th. Obviously, we were sort of hair's breadth from maybe more human tragedy. And at the same time, there was never a question about the succession of power in this country. Institutions held firm. Having been in Washington the day that after the election, everyone I knew in the Trump administration was preparing to leave. And I don't think actually that was ever in doubt. Secondly, I think we're overstating the divisions and the factionalism, and we're making it louder because, yes, our social media is louder, our cable news is louder, but, go to the library at Hopkins, look up newspapers from the late 1800s, writing about sort of presidential politics and the insults flying back and forth, read the yellow press. Factionalism and fighting rhetorically is part of democracy, and it's been part of American democracy for much longer than we care to admit. In fact, there's an aberration that because we had a much more serious role in the world, that we moved away from it and have now moved back. Maybe we find it unseemly, but it's not unnatural. So I just think I just worry that we're kind of talking ourselves into something. And the last thing is, we had a civil war in this country over a very real issue. It is very hard to imagine people taking up arms over a tweet. And that is kind of where we are. I really think that fundamentally much more unites this country than we care to admit. And anyway.
So there are two very distinct positions forming on this issue of how seriously to take the level of division in this country. Is there any response to Matt's more deflationary position on this?
Well, among my sins is being a lifetime student of the Civil War, and so I'm going to agree with Matt certainly in this regard. There is nothing in our politics today that begins to approach the level of seriousness, moral, political, you name it, than slavery did in 1860. That's just a historical distortion that does not serve us very well. Not to diminish the divisions among us, and what worries me is the consequences of those divisions, that we are paralyzed by them, not that they threaten to really tear our society apart. Texas is not going to secede as far as I can tell.
Jeff.
So I think in the United States, I think there's a tendency in the United States to be a little, sorry. Yeah. I think when you have these kind of discussions in the United States, one of the challenges is that we're sometimes imprisoned in our own history. The discussions about political divisions, about civil war, political violence, we look at it through the lens of past American experience because that's what we're familiar with. And while I certainly agree that we're not going to see something like what happened in 1860, I think if you look at the experience of other countries that have had these sorts of political divisions and questions of institutional legitimacy, you can come up with a lot of bad outcomes that don't look like the American Civil War. They can look like the Troubles in Ireland. They can look like the kind of low-level, sustained political violence that you had in a number of Latin American countries, or in Turkey in the 1970s, or in Italy. So I think there's a wide range of bad outcomes, all of which could have significant consequences for political order in the United States, but also for the role of the U.S. as a global actor. And so I wouldn't fixate entirely on the Civil War and be comforted by the fact that the divisions that we have today are not likely to lead to a new 1860s style American Civil War. And I do think actually, on the point that you made, there's nothing that divides Americans to the extent that slavery did in the 1860s. I think that's true, but not as true as perhaps it's being made out to be on this panel, because I do think there are other things that are maybe up to that border. Belief in democracy may be the big one here. So January 6th was bad. I live on Capitol Hill. I had a front row seat for some of this. It was bad. That story's not over. That story didn't end on January 6th. When you have people running for elections, not only at the federal level, but at the local and state and county level, whose basic principles rest on the questioning of democratic outcomes, questioning the value of democracy as a system, questioning whether certain people deserve to have their voices heard, and people like that get into positions of power, not necessarily the White House or the Capitol, but city halls, counties, courthouses around the country. That creates a very widespread, a very deep-rooted division and an issue that I think a lot of people are going to feel very passionate about, and where the potential for real violence, I think, exists.
We have another question, and then Horace, I'll have you respond first after that. Please, a new question.
So question going back to the earlier commentary around China and military power. I've had the opportunity to visit China a number of times over the last 20 years, and there's a very strong focus on GDP and economic growth and dominance. It seems as if they feel like the last few hundred years are a blip on the map, and they want to very focused, in a focused way, want to get back to kind of what they presume their right is in the world, right? The question that I have is, if they are to become a dominant economic power, how important or to what degree do you also have to become a dominant military power to make that happen?
Yeah, Horace, do you want to step in?
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
I want to. That's a great question. But before I respond to your question as best I think that I can, I just want to follow up with my colleague. When January 6th happened, I was not surprised. There have been a group of scholars that I'm a part of. We were talking about these things at least 7 years before it happened. Now, the question is, we didn't believe that democracy would end that day. What we see it as a woman in labor, right? These are birth pains. So this is one wave. But there are other waves to come, to be sure. I disagree with my learning scholar that, well, it's not as bad. Each wave will get worse than the previous wave. Now, does it mean that we're toast? No. Believe it or not, the only people who could save the American Republic is the American people. But that will take all American people who have somewhat been left behind the so-called American capitalist dream to get together, to understand each other. Liberals don't understand why white, rural, uneducated people support Donald Trump. But if you spend enough time in the South and with rural whites, you will understand why. If urban and rural people could get together in the United States, we could save the American Republic overnight. To my colleagues' question, there is definitely a shift in the global economy away from the United States. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's a very slow shuffle. And I'll give you some, not just anecdotal evidence. I don't like to talk to people and use anecdotal evidence. I'll tell you some systematic evidence. The IMF reported, and you could fact check this. The IMF reported the first quarter or the second quarter of this year, about 40% of central banks around the world have moved away from the dollar as the reserve currency to the Chinese yuan. That's significant. Now, it doesn't mean that the dollar doesn't dominate the global economy. The US dollar still does. But it's a slow shuffle away from the dollar. Give you some anecdotal evidence. Saudi Arabia, America's major ally in the Middle East, is building a multi-billion-dollar oil processing, not in the United States, but in China. Israel, an American key ally in the Middle East, is also shifting its reserve currency away from the dollar to the Chinese yuan. Slow shift, very subtle shuffle, but significant. And it is something that Americans, we should be concerned about and we should pay particular attention to.
Diane, did you say we have another question?
Yes, we do.
All right.
Okay. I actually have several questions, but obviously we don't have the time. But with regard to China, the problem I see is that
We have so many thousands of Chinese students coming to our colleges. They're majoring in math and science fields and taking the knowledge they acquire, and most of them are going back to China and using that information to obviously help their country. Our businesses are willing to basically sell us out so they can make a quick dollar, whether it's the cheap products that we buy from China or for our companies to sell to China. Now, with regard to Russia, I guess I see Russia more as trying to secure their borders. So I'm not as concerned about Russia because historically they've been invaded so many times over the centuries. With the United States, I think our problem is our national debt, which both political parties are very irresponsible. I think that's going to hurt us in the end, and also the lowering of our academic standards. And I would just like you to comment on that.
So I'll take a few comments from whoever wants to jump in on that. And we can wrap up.
Sure.
So, Jeff, why don't you start?
Okay. Let me start with China. The growth of academic links with China has been very significant over the last couple of decades, primarily in sciences and math. And I think that in part is a reflection of the point that you made at the end of your remarks about academic standards. There are not a lot of American graduate students who go into particularly engineering fields, I think in part because they have not been prepared to do that. And if you look around at the science and physics and engineering departments at most universities, there are very few native-born American students doing graduate-level work.
That's right.
And that's a problem of the American education system. As far as the Chinese and other students who come here, this gets to a point that was made earlier in the conversation about the American immigration system. We spend a lot of money bringing people over, educating them, and then we won't give them a visa or a green card, and they go home, and they go work for companies that don't, at the very least, contribute to the American economy, and in some cases, may go work for state-owned Chinese enterprises or, something else that we see as being strategically problematic. So I think fixing the education system and fixing the immigration system together would go a long way towards addressing the problems that you identified. I have lots of thoughts about Russia, because that's what I mostly work on, but I know we're a little short on time, so I'm going to punt on that.
Very good. Who else wants to jump in?
I agree with you. I was applauding you while you asked your question. And I completely agree with pretty much most things that my colleague just said. But I want to just add one thing. This was predicted 20 years ago. I remember when I was in graduate school, and it's not that too long ago, I watched on C-SPAN all of the top tech giants, Microsoft, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs at the time, for Apple, the guy that was running Google, I don't remember his name. They testified in Congress. And this was in the late maybe the early 2000s. And they told Congress that, to my colleague's point, if you do not beef up science and math from elementary school all the way through colleges, this is a threat to our business. And you will leave us with no choice but to go where the talent is. And that's exactly what we saw. Now, to your other point, you said Russia is protecting its borders. And I know many of my colleagues here are going to probably vehemently disagree with what I'm about to say. Okay? But again, it's facts. Let's deal with the facts. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was predicted in the early 1990s. Did you know that? Did anyone know that? It was predicted in the 1990s. And you know who predicted it? I could tell you. George Kennan. Anyone know who George Kennan is? George Kennan is to American foreign policy as Moses is to the Judaic law. He wrote American foreign policy. He was the first ambassador to the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Cold War. He wrote the blueprint about containment. Before he died, this is what George Kennan said. You could go check it out for yourself. It was in a security magazine. And he said, if the United States continues to treat Russia, this is after the Soviet Union collapsed. This is in the so-called post-Cold War. If they continue to treat Russia as if they were the old Soviet Union by continuing to expand NATO, Kennan said, the purpose for NATO that I supported is no longer with us. Why do we need NATO when the communist threat is gone? And he said, if they continue to expand NATO, no Russian government would accept it. Now, this is George Kennan. He was not alone. In an open letter, and I would like everyone to Google it and find this, an open letter to then Secretary of State in the Clinton administration of over 20 former senior U.S. State Department officials. One was also a former Secretary of Defense who resigned in the Clinton administration over this issue. They wrote an open letter to then Secretary of Defense saying, we oppose the continued expansion of NATO, and it is going to lead to war, an unnecessary conflict. Now, this is the type of thing that infuriates me. You know why? Because we pride ourselves in this country as having all these freedoms, freedom of the press, people can make informed decisions. And yet still, the American public, no one ever said, wait a second, we've had over 20-something former foreign policy experts working at the highest parts of government, an open letter, we could all read it now, predicted what would happen. Why are we doing this? But what we so often do as Americans, instead of doing what the so-called founding fathers encourage us to do, which is have a critical and skeptical view of government, we put on the pom-poms and we become cheerleaders. And just one last point. It is said because of this, the American people are likened to the children of a mob boss. Listen to what I'm saying. The American people are likened to the children of a mob boss. When one day a firebomb is thrown through the window and they say, why would anyone want to do that to us? Because daddy is a good guy. Because they're completely uninformed about what daddy is doing. This is not what the so-called founding fathers wanted for the American people. And most of our problems is because the American people are totally disengaged. And so foreign policy is run by an elite for the interests of the elite and not for the interests of the larger American public.
Thank you. I'm starting to get the signal that we need to be wrapping up. I want to have Matt respond, and then Giselle, I'm going to give you the last word.
we had a debate over NATO expansion 25 years ago, and it was a robust debate. George Kennan got the X letter right, but throughout the rest of his career, I think his views on Russia were, let's say, to a certain extreme. I think it is incredible to imagine Europe right now if NATO had not expanded, and how unstable and how violent it would be. The only tragedy is that NATO, which was not brought in as the Ukrainians wanted to be brought in. Let's just remember, NATO is an alliance of democracies where countries choose to join. No one makes them join, they choose to join. Finland and Sweden have just joined, and Sweden, having rejected decades of neutrality because it sees a threat to their democracy and their security from a rising Russia. It's not very complicated. It's not very complicated. Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for their country, they're facing an existential threat, they are dying by the thousands, they were invaded by a totalitarian ruler who has, let's say, funny notions of what Russia is and what Russia could be, who runs a country that has no dissent, that has pushed out its best people overseas, and is hopefully going to lose this war with our help that the Ukrainians are asking for. I think it is dangerous to play domestic ideological games with foreign policy when there are real stakes out there. Having lived in Ukraine from 1994 to 1997, having spent a lot of time in Russia and Ukraine for the last 25 years, I can tell you that there is a right and there's a wrong, and we are, at least in this one case, on the side of the damn right.
Just hold on.
I want to say just real quick.
Very, very quickly.
This is the argument of the foreign policy establishment, that there was a debate about NATO, and Kennan lost the debate.
There was a vote in the Senate. There was a vote in the Senate. You had a long. You had the stage for a long time. There's a vote in the Senate.
Let me finish though. Let me finish this.
Last words, and then
That's only part of the story. That's the procedural part of the story. When the Soviet Union collapsed, all of the arms contractors, in fact, Stephen Hadley, I believe his name, lobbyist for Lockheed Martin, in addressing his shareholders, he said, "We have to make Russia a bad guy again because it's hurting our bottom line." So NATO's expansion is tied to corporate capital accumulation. Okay? So let's not get wrapped up in these procedural arguments about there was a debate.
okay. So Horace,
That's almost like, hold on, that's almost like Jesus Christ coming back and said, "You know, guys, disciples, I think I made a mistake about something," and they said, "Well, no, Jesus, now you had it right the first time, but now you're wrong."
okay. So Jeff, why don't you wrap it up for us?
Okay. So I do want to give Giselle the last word. So really quickly, the main proponents of NATO expansion in the 1990s were the peoples and the governments of Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, many of the other countries that became NATO members. And it was something that was demand-driven as much as it was supply-driven. The second point I want to make, you can see this, this was reported in the press yesterday or today, Dmitry Kozak, who has long been President Putin's sort of special envoy for the post-Soviet space, in February negotiated a deal with President Zelensky that basically would have seen Ukraine forswear the pursuit of NATO membership. He brought this deal back to Moscow, gave it to President Putin, and President Putin rejected it and launched the war. So if this were really a war about Ukraine's prospects of joining NATO, that deal would have been accepted. Clearly this war is driven by other things.
Giselle, last word.
Last word about procedures. Procedures are how democracies govern themselves. It's how the rule of law is promulgated and upheld, as we have done for almost 250 years. The United States, in the post-World War II and in the post-Cold War era, has created a world governed more by rules and less by sheer might or power than any recorded history prior to this. So yes, we embrace procedures. We need procedures. We need to preserve procedures. Otherwise, we'll be like beasts in the jungle, like Hobbesian leviathans at one another's throat. We want a world that's governed by rules, by laws that are made by men to preserve individual rights, not just in this country, but around the world.
Okay, and with that, please join me in thanking our panelists for this robust discussion. And thanks to all of you in person and in Zoom for joining us this evening.
Yes, I want to thank our wonderful panel. I want to thank our hosts for hosting us tonight. Couldn't have done it without you, and all the guests who came. I hope you enjoyed this thought-provoking talk we had tonight. Please visit us at greattalk.org to find out when our next talk is. Just want to remind you, if you did like it, you know, we're a nonprofit, so we do accept donations. And thank you for taking the trip, everybody. And Bill, thank you very much, and we hope we see you again.